街の明かりがぼやけてる理解できぬ何も見えぬ静かな街の声が
Hey, my name is Christian Highland. I'm joined here by my co-host here, Phil Wharton, and you're listening to the AI Hype podcast. Got a pretty cool episode today, a bit off the beaten track. We're going to be looking at the Japanese AI ecosystem.
Hey, Phil Worthen here. Yeah, I'm super excited for this chat. I feel like not a lot of people talk about Japan as far as like AI is concerned.
Yeah, I think it's easy for Japan to get sort of, overshadowed in terms of the AI marketplace, given just the incredible development in AI in the U.S. and China, and given the sheer amount of manpower, money, and resources that the Chinese and the Americans are throwing at the AI race.
Yeah, and to me, it's surprising because in my head, I always think of Japan as this like technological leader, but then AI rolled around and it's like, where's Japan? Like, why are we not talking about Japan in all of this? Even South Korea, like you think of as like a big technological leader with like Samsung TVs and the smartphones and some of the cars that are coming out of there. Like it's all pretty good stuff. And then AI comes around and it's like, well, where do they go?
Yeah, so unfortunately, in many respects, Japan has been stagnating technologically. When we were growing up, when you would think of a Japanese phone or a Japanese piece of technology, you would think that's sort of like a premier piece of technology. It's advanced, it's cutting edge. But really, that hasn't been the case for almost 15 years, maybe more. You think about smartphones, Samsung, Apple, not Japanese products. But in Japan, I think they've really focused on kind of key niches these last 15 years of precision tools, industrial applications, etc. So I think Japan is really focused on what it's good at, and maybe not been as on the bleeding edge of a lot of new technologies.
Yeah, I think another way we could think about it is like, after we did our research for this episode, it becomes like very clear Japan is approaching the whole LLM integration in a different way than the China-US race is. And it'll be kind of fun to talk about some of these things.
Yeah, and sort of the AI applications are again kind of geared toward industries where Japan is a leader or is building great products. So I think robotics, industrial automation, and in AI, kind of more compact, efficient models. But yeah, excited with that. So I can go ahead and kick things off. So the first AI startup that we're going to talk to today, and I think maybe the most interesting one, is called Sakana AI. So Sakana AI is focused on building efficient AI models. Recently, they released something called their temporarily adaptive interpolated distillation technology, which enables small models to retain knowledge from larger ones. For example, this is their Tiny Swallow 1.5B, which can run on smartphones, which is something that even OpenAI and some of the Chinese competitors have struggled with.
Yeah, this is actually something that DeepSeek has kind of taken in a similar direction, but a different way, where DeepSeek is using specialty agent models within the larger model. And what that effectively does is the same thing as the TAID, where it's taking knowledge from like the bigger data set, so like the 70 billion parameter set, and then like distilling it down into these smaller and smaller ones, which are essentially like specialists. And so it's kind of cool that the Tiny Swallow is able to run on edge compute, or edge devices rather. And I think that'll be part of the next race, is like getting AI small enough and efficient enough to run and performant enough to run on an edge device.
and the US have been building these massive and incredible LLMs that require a massive amount of compute. There's also a second race ongoing for how do we distill these into smaller and smaller models that can be put into things like smartphones or tanks or refrigerators, whatever the case might be. And obviously DeepSeek is doing a great job of this. And it seems like with the TAID model, Sakana AI is sort of, I wouldn't say leader, but figuring out a very good way of how do we take a gigantic model and distill it into a component that is usable by a smartphone, which has a lot of implications, especially given Japan's focus on robotics and other areas, industrial applications. You don't need a industrial AI to know how to write great poetry or do financial research. You really need that industrial tool to really understand the layout of a factory, understand sort of the parameters of what can go on with construction within a factory, manufacturing within a factory, and sort of you're creating models really that are bespoke and geared toward those use cases.
I think one of the other advantages that gets my gears turning on the different ways that different countries might be using LLMs is Sakana is one of the leaders in Japanese LLM, and it makes me think, like, how close is OpenAI to building a equivalent Japanese LLM into their multi-language models, and then once they build it, how does their accuracy compare to something like the Sakana accuracy? Because depending on how that goes, there's 100+ major languages around the world, right? Like there's 170 something countries, and every country has their own variation of their own language. It'd be interesting, like, if OpenAI is not able to rapidly pump out language after language after language, which I wonder if they are, like, they must have a language team that's just constantly training new languages. Anyways, depending on OpenAI's ability to do that, if they're not able to do that, that opens this wide, this race wide open to other LLMs to create language specific LLMs for that country.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think we'd have to look to see how much training OpenAI is doing in Japanese, but I would suspect it's not anywhere near what a Japanese company would do. And if you're a Japanese firm and you're looking at different AI products to integrate into your stack, you're probably going to have a preference for ones that trained in Japanese if you're in Japan. I'm thinking about like sales, right? Like you might have an AI that's trained on sales, but sort of the culture, how you write, all these things, all this background might be totally different in the US versus Japan, especially on like regulatory things, on healthcare. I mean, the list goes on. I think there's an opportunity where a Japanese AI company could really dominate within the Japanese market. And I wonder if you're going to start seeing sort of these walled gardens around the world where the English-speaking world has its own set of AI tooling. There's sort of the Chinese sphere, and then kind of bespoke AI companies in different language groups, so Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, etc.
Yeah, I think this will be like a really determinative next few months, to see how does something like Sakana compare to OpenAI. It's going to be really impactful, the results of their accuracy head-to-head against OpenAI, definitely.
Do you see a world in which Sakana is able to compete in the US, or are they just too far behind in the race?
Before DeepSeek, I would have said, no, there's no way. After DeepSeek, absolutely. Yeah. Like if they're able to do it well, I can definitely see a world where, there's little segmented LLMs per region or language. Because it's really all about performance. Like how fast does the thing respond to you, and how accurate is that response? and how long can it go without, falling off the rails and start hallucinating. Maybe in 6 months we'll see how Sakana specifically performs, but it could just be like another hedge fund. Like DeepSeek is so funny because it's literally just a hedge fund tool that they created essentially to give themselves an edge, and they decided to release their one of their models.
What are you seeing on Hugging Face about Sakana AI's tiny swallow model?
Let me look that up. It doesn't look like the Sakana model for TAID is like commercially viable yet. But they're taking an approach that looks a little bit different, where they're not trying to supervise the fine tuning, but rather have a teacher-student model where TAID is essentially training a smaller model.
The next startup / company in the AI space we're going to look at in Japan is called Mujin. So Mujin really specializes in AI-driven industrial automation. Their machine learning system allows robots to perform complex tasks without explicit programming. So what do I mean by that? One product Mujin has out on the market is something that can efficiently unload different size boxes from a truck. So they're really geared toward real-time motion planning, dexterous grasping, making it a really valuable tool for logistics and manufacturing applications.
Yeah, this one I'm really excited about because I think it takes AI back to its roots, where before LLMs came out, AI was this. It feels like an entirely different field of people trying to figure out smart ways to automate actions and have AI make decisions on those actions. And so robotics is like the natural, it's the thing that makes the most sense of applying AI. Like that's the ultimate end goal. And so for Mujin to continue to develop in like the machine intelligence space, I think it's really exciting, especially with the larger question of, how do LLMs and the way that LLMs think, how does that impact the way that a company like Mujin might be building their machine intelligence? Before it was basically like a set of algorithms that's constantly thinking and evaluating and reevaluating based off of like computer vision and stuff like that. LLMs kind of wildly or radically change how we can do things, from text-based input to image input to video input. We're now an audio input. We're now able to create wildly different outcomes and automation with LLM AI. And so it'll be cool to see, like, does that translate directly into machine robotics? Into robotics with machine intelligence.
And I think Mujin is really solving real problems for Japan, right? I mean, Japan, like South Korea and a lot of countries, has an aging population, and coupled with limited, inflow of folks, so there's not going to be as many people able to do the more manual tasks, things like unloading a truck or loading a truck, or kind of more of these hands-on manual tasks. So it's interesting to see Mujin take Japan's focus on robotics, bring in AI, and sort of solve this real problem. And the TruckBot actually won some awards last year on its dexterous handling of boxes. So I'm going to see if I can just go ahead and pull up that video and play it.
TruckBot, we have an automatic unloading system that can go into your container or trailer and pick the cases directly out for downstream processing. TruckBot is a robot built from the ground up, designed and manufactured by Mujin. TruckBot features a novel convey-through concept where an end-of-arm tool is able to pick, lift, and pull back onto a convey belt surface.
It's not just grabbing items and putting them on the conveyor, it is the conveyor.
Boy, I never thought I'd get that excited about boxes. Ooh, man. But yeah, that's, again, very interesting focus and tied to Japan's focus on robotics. Okay, so the next startup we're going to look at is called Stockmark. Stockmark is developing Japanese language LLMs that specialize in business applications, market analysis, sentiment detection, and predictive analytics, among other things. Obviously, there's a huge market for financial firms, hedge funds to be able to crunch a ton of data with AI. Phil, I know you have a ton of thoughts there.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. Like DeepSeek themselves, they're a hedge fund, and when they created DeepSeek originally, the R1 model, that was so that they could get an edge in the market. And so it makes sense that you have financial institutions that are creating their own unique LLMs designed specifically to like hyper analyze information and sentiment across the entire open internet. So Stockmark is primarily focused on Japan, which makes sense because I think even if I throw Japanese into OpenAI, it's not 100% accurate. And it probably misses those cultural like undertones. So it'll be interesting to see if things like these walled gardens for financial institution models pays dividends down the road.
With Stockmark, I think it's a lot of what we also covered with Sakana AI. They're really focused on training toward the Japanese market. So a statistics I've seen from AWS is that only 0.1% of training data is actually Japanese. So this is sort of the training data that other large-scale language models are training on. So what Stockmark actually has done is gathered approximately 220 billion tokens from domestic market data and technical management data to really train specifically on the Japanese market. So this is something that big Japanese players like Panasonic, Nippon Steel are really leveraging for them to utilize AI more efficiently within the Japanese market itself. So again, OpenAI, great in the US market, great in the English-speaking world. DeepSeek and the other five tigers, great in Chinese, probably pretty good in English as well. But again, for this very specific use case in Japan, a whole different data set. And it seems like places like Stockmark are going deep on training within Japanese data.
So it seems like this is a serious effort to create a model for the Japanese community. Like definitely huge leap forward in as far as like creating a LLM that is hyper focused on Japanese language and culture.
I mean, even if Japan is a smaller market than the US and China, obviously, I think for startups that can really get ownership of that market in Japan and build sort of fiefdoms within the Japanese market, there's huge opportunity for growth there. I think OpenAI might be making the assumption that, hey, 0.1% is enough for Japan, and we can kind of turn our OpenAI loose on Japan and sort of compete. But I wonder if you start putting this out to businesses, you start putting this out into Panasonic, Nippon Steel, transportation systems, factories, and then sort of out in sort of the wild, it becomes glaringly obvious that it's not trained on Japanese data sets, Japanese information, And that's sort of where the hallucinations, or not even hallucinations, OpenAI is saying, hey, this is how I've been taught to deal with this issue. And in this cultural context and in this linguistic environment, it just falls short glaringly and causes companies to pull back from maybe US or Chinese branded AIs. And something I'll to point out is when I actually, right now I was asking OpenAI to compare Stockmark to DeepSeek and kind of give me the thought on kind of Japanese versus Chinese companies. And OpenAI was convinced that DeepSeek was a Japanese company, and I'll share that. And I kind of pushed it like, no, DeepSeek's not a Japanese company, it's a Chinese company, and said there's no available information saying DeepSeek is a Chinese company, which I thought was a pretty bizarre hallucination, but again, maybe shows the English-speaking focus of OpenAI, whereas OpenAI maybe has public access to publications about the founding or creation or investors in OpenAI. Maybe it lacks that information or has less access to it for non-English speaking publications and non-US companies.
And one like little detail to flavor this conversation: Japan is still the third largest economy in the world, and Tokyo is the largest city economy in the world. And so like the sheer amount of GDP output, even though 0.1% of the OAI model was dedicated to Japanese, like there's still an enormous force as far as production capability. And I think Germany's right up next after them.
I think it's really interesting that I think as we're making this podcast, you and I are kind of nerding out on Stockmark, and me, but especially you, are super involved in the space. So it's interesting that it's kind of flown under the radar, right? Like we've heard really almost nothing about it. There isn't really much interest in Western press on it.
Yeah.
It's an interesting fact. Next on our list is a company in Japan called Preferred Networks. Preferred Networks is Japan's really leading AI company and sort of known for cutting edge AI research. They're most well known for their Playmo 100B model, as well as a smaller Playmo 1B model that's really geared toward edge devices. We mistakenly attributed one of their white papers to Stockmark, so apologies there. But we're really excited to jump into Preferred Networks. I think most recently they've been benchmarking their models against GPT-4, which is obviously not the latest model for OpenAI, but still a pretty strong model. And at least in Japan specific topics, have done pretty well on average, but obviously a lot can be sort of represented in different ways with statistics. But over to you, Phil, for your thoughts on Preferred Networks.
Yeah, this one was actually really interesting. Christian and I did like a deeper dive on this one in our research, and it's kind of cool to see Japan pushing really hard to compete on the Japanese language performance. And so we took a look at some of the stats around Playmo 100 billion parameter model and see how it compares to GPT-4. So in their marketing material, Preferred Networks really touts like, hey, we're better than GPT-4. And this was back in like September, I think, of 2024, where they're trying to do their benchmark testing. So they're saying, hey, we're better than, we perform better than GPT-4 on these Japanese language benchmark tests. So there's 3 of them, and we perform better, which is like really cool to hear, right? Like GPT-4 was great when it first came out. I don't know if you remember, Christian, like when we were at 3.5, GPT 3.5, and then we had GPT 3.5 Turbo, and Turbo was this like amazing thing because 3.5 was great. Turbo was great and fast. And then 4 came out, and 4 like blew everybody's minds away. Everybody was like, oh my gosh, this is like good. I think 4 is when people started to be like, this is like gonna replace people. This is gonna take over jobs, and like, you know, this is like the thing that is like the precipitates, you know, change, like real change. We can see the change. And so the fact that Playmo is trying to compare against GPT-4 is like a pretty big deal, right? Like that's how I take it, is we have this thing that's like going to change the world. Now let's compare these Japanese models against the one that everybody knows about, GPT-4. So when we're diving into the benchmark testing, yes, Playmo beats on average GPT-4, but it's really interesting to see like the actual breakdown of how it performs. There's usually like inside the benchmark, you have the average, which is the final, you know, final number that's averaged across a few different tests. And then you have individual different types of tests that they test all the different models against. And in that, Playmo doesn't win everything, and that was really interesting. Is I thought Playmo was just going to like wipe the board and, you know, just wipe GPT-4, but GPT-4 actually wins in a couple of instances, which was really shocking to kind of like see.
Yeah, and yeah, just to note, the benchmark that they're referencing for the performance against GPT-4 is called the Rakuda benchmark, which is really evaluating across topics in Japanese. So these are things like Japanese domestic topics of geography, politics, history, society. So again, you know, I think it's a good caveat that the performance we're looking at is sort of how is it performing in a Japanese context. And I think to your point, where they really had limitations, or maybe where they fall a bit short compared to GPT-4, is especially in math and coding. So that was kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, and well, one thing I do want to point out is like, even though Playmo might win in an area, Playmo is only winning by, you know, 10% or less, right? Like that's how close GPT-4 is to Playmo. And let me caveat all this with saying I'm very bullish after reading this. I'm very bullish on Playmo because I understand what they're trying to do. And so I'm not trying to say like Playmo is bad or Playmo has no future. I'm actually the opposite. Because of this, Playmo has like a tremendous future. But what I'm looking at is, you know, in geography, Playmo scores a 9.7. GPT scores a 9.4. It's only 0.3 off of GPT-4. GPT-4 is only 0.3 off of Playmo. Again, history. Playmo 9.8, GPT-4 9.5. That's again 0.3 away, right? So it's not like these huge gaps in performance. It's like a very close gap. There's a couple of other tests, benchmark tests that they use. One is called Jaster, and GPT-4 wins on multiple choice questions. It wins on math reasoning, which are kind of like the GPT strengths in general. And then for question and answering, it also wins. Playmo on average has a higher score again. But the weird thing is when GPT wins, it's either winning like there's like a very tight race. So multiple choice, very tight race. Math reasoning, GPT-4 0.97, Playmo 0.78. And so I think that's going to be the biggest gap, is inside of math, where and QA is the other one, where there's a big gap, a bigger than 10% gap. So it'll be really cool to see how preferred networks, kind of like continues to build on this model. And like ultimately the vision is it's not to be, you know, as good as GPT-4. It's just to like outperform 4 altogether, right? Like they're probably looking at 4 Omni, they're probably looking at DeepSeek and kind of re-evaluate. I would hope that Preferred Networks is looking at the DeepSeek R1 paper, white paper, and re-evaluating their entire method for building out a model. Because I think that can be like a huge game changer is, you know, how can Playmo build on R1, DeepSeek R1, and kind of like build out the next model for the future?
I think where I'm actually super bullish on Preferred Networks, but even Stockmark and the others is on a couple points. One, I think Preferred Networks is just going to keep specializing in Japan and iterating so that it's the best product for a Japanese company. And obviously, Japan's still a very large economy. I think they're there, and I think you're going to have a lot of models globally, a lot of these. And I think in Japan, they're going to have a strong ability to really go deep on what the needs are of that market and training accordingly. You know, but I think just as important is Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry has something called the GENIAC program. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but essentially a generative AI initiative. So not only are you going to have the Japanese investing in generative AI, but I imagine the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry is also going to be going out to Panasonic, going out to Fujitsu, going out to Toyota and saying like, hey, like, we want you to work with these Japanese LLMs. We need to have a Japanese-based economy. And I imagine they're going to incentivize it both financially, from a regulatory perspective, and also the personal perspective of, you know, the senior leaders at these Japanese companies and senior leaders in government are going to want to see a national AI industry, a national AI sort of power center. So I think you're just going to see this combination of they're naturally going deep on Japan, and there's all these incentives from the government and pressure to work with them. So I think, you know, this makes me think that Japan is going to be a player in the AI space. It's going to have strong LLMs. You know, will it actually ever be as cutting edge as OpenAI or some of these Chinese unicorns? Maybe not, but I still think they're going to be quite advanced and quite pervasive within at least the Japanese economy.
Yeah, I think that ties into like another one of the sections that we're looking at in our research, which is how does Preferred Networks been designing AI chips and supercomputing? And so Preferred Networks has their own proprietary compute processors called MN Core. That's like specifically tailored for AI. NVIDIA's come out with specific GPUs that are built for AI, and that's a big growing area in the cloud compute infrastructure area, where they're building data warehouses all over the world that are solely dedicated for cloud compute or for AI compute. And so for Preferred Networks to be leaning on this specifically to like help them grow, I think is another good sign. Like not only is Japan in general trying to build out, you know, their own infrastructure that can build AI chips, so that, you know, they're not just depending on NVIDIA GPUs like H100s, but, you know, eventually having there's a really cool thing with Apple. Like one of the reasons Apple is so good is because they own the actual processor and they own the software. And so when they own those two pieces together, they can write the code specifically to take advantage of the processor and vice versa. They can build the processor specifically to enhance their code. And so from a strategic perspective, Preferred Networks doing something similar where they're writing the LLM, the 100 billion parameter model, and they're also trying to design a chip that can like help them think better and reason better, I think in the long term, there's a lot of benefit for them to build that out, because as they do these, partnerships with industry, like when they partner with Toyota, or Panasonic or anything like that, like they're going to have more chips available for their specific regions that are going to need to take advantage of LLMs. It's a really good strategy, and I think as they continue to improve, I think it'll start paying dividends in the very near future. I think like less than a year, we're going to start hearing more stuff coming out of Japan.
Yeah, so building on your last point, there's an interesting initiative on the chip front where Preferred Networks is sort of working with the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Obviously they're sort of the chip manufacturer for NVIDIA as well, but kind of showing that they're looking to have that in-house capability as well. Okay, continuing on, the next company we're going to look at is SoftBank Robotics. Obviously, this company is best known for its humanoid robot Pepper, that has been kind of widely used in retail, hospitality, and customer service. SoftBank Robotics has a real strong position for its brand, for its company in Japan and Europe.
I love how innovative SoftBank Robotics is. Their Pepper robot, you've probably seen it in the news. Have you seen it around, Christian?
A bit, but mostly in like a press release where it's at like a tech conference doing something in front of folks.
Yeah. They've tried a couple of humanoid robots, and Pepper is a really interesting use case. In China, they have these robots that are more like drones, where they like deliver food for you. So instead of having a waiter kind of bring your food out, these drones kind of like drive over to you. It looks like a rectangular prism kiosk thing that like pulls up to you, and then like a tray comes out. They have some of them in Japan, I think. And like that's a use case that kind of makes sense. The SoftBank Robotics Pepper robot is like it's a really interesting way to see like, can we start to enhance the customer experience of like in-person education, using like a semi-humanoid robot. So it'll be really interesting if this takes off, because it is a blend of like the old school AI mixed with the new LLMs, where this robot is trying to talk to people, it's trying to interact with them, it's sharing knowledge about whatever space they're at.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm looking on the SoftBank Robotics website and seeing obviously Pepper, which is geared toward like customer service, but really engaging people in person at a location. They also have like a delivery robot that's kind of geared toward restaurants. I've seen them when I was traveling around Japan, but I actually don't know if they're a SoftBank's robotic kind of food delivery robot, or maybe just some knockoff, cheaper version. And then finally, they also have like a more intelligent cleaning robot. So kind of interesting, but yeah, I think it's adoption seems like it could be tough.
Yeah, I was just looking through their other stuff too. The robots that they're building for vacuums and like floor mopping, that makes sense. Like, I feel like that's an obvious one to build towards.
Yeah, and I think Japan's an interesting use case because obviously aging population, especially as you get out of Tokyo more into rural areas. You have cities where the average age of the person might be 60. So I think it's an interesting test case and interesting use case for this will be in that market and beyond. Yeah, it's sort of tough. I think about, could a U.S. retail store have only a robot? And I think most cities you kind of need a person that can deal with even just all the bad things that can go on in a store, in a retail location, versus Japan is just so much more organized and people are just so much more respectful of rules. I wonder if like Pepper could run the show at a store in Tokyo, but maybe in New York or Chicago, like a lot of other bad things could happen. So
Okay. Some of these things look pretty expensive. I don't know the price points on any of them. Actually, I wonder how much they cost. So the Pepper robot costs 30,000, which is, you know, for that robot, maybe that makes sense. I don't know. The food service robot is called Bella, and that's 20,000. And then they also have another called Servi, which is 1,000 per month, so 12,000 per year. Which that seems like a lot, but then not a lot at the same time, right? Because you don't have to pay a person to like walk back and forth, but you're probably not able to eliminate a job, so now it's like an additional cost, but reduced waiting times. So now people aren't waiting as long for their food, and maybe that's worth it from a customer experience perspective.
yeah, I don't know. I can't get over that Pepper kind of feels gimmicky in the sense that so you have Pepper in your store. Pepper can answer questions from the customer. They can engage them, but can Pepper go get something from the back for the customer? Can Pepper actually close the deal? Can Pepper actually... Is Pepper one of those things where you're like, wow, that's cool. Excuse me, Pepper, I'm going to go find someone that can actually help me. I wonder if that's kind of what Pepper is. And then, you know, on the food service bot, again, these things are driving out the food to the table, but someone's still got to load the food onto it. Someone's supposed to take the food off of it. So I just wonder, you know, maybe it can reduce headcount in a restaurant, but I wonder if it's also sort of gimmicky where I forget the chain of restaurants, but there's like a chain of restaurants in Japan where food's not that great, but they have they're just known for having robot waiters, and so like kids are like, wow, I want to go see the robots, and you know, we went to one, and my kids were just standing on their chairs wanting to see the robot move around, and it was interesting, but is it really a game changer yet? And you know, I wonder if there's just a ways to go in robotics and integration with AI to really get there.
I definitely think there's a longer wait time, especially with Pepper. Hand movement is like a super challenging thing for robots right now. There's a whole thread about the Tesla bots and like how they're able to pick stuff up and move them around and everything. There's a lot of doubt if, you know, those Tesla bots are actually having AI control the hand movement as well. And so Pepper, you know, it faces the same challenge of how do you do hand movement. It's unlikely that they've cracked the code, because I feel like you would hear about it everywhere. Whoever figures out the hand thing it's gonna be huge news, because that's like a very difficult thing where robots basically, you know, either destroy things by just like crushing, like sheer crushing power, or like they don't pick it up because they're afraid. So yeah, that'll be like a really interesting thing to see come out of SoftBank.
Hey, thanks everyone. So that was our overview of the Japanese AI ecosystem. Kind of looking at the ecosystem, I'd say there's a lot of interesting development coming out of Japan. I wouldn't sleep on it. Places like Sakana AI and Stockmark are building interesting tools and in some cases LLMs that are really geared toward the Japanese market and training, more importantly, training on Japanese data, meaning they may end up being the go-to leaders in the Japanese market when it comes to integrating AI across businesses. There's also a lot of great stuff happening in robotics, etc. But there's some big limiting factors, right? Japan has a very limited manpower situation when compared to the US and China. And in terms of capital being invested, the amount of capital being invested in Japan pales in comparison to what's being invested in China and the US, where it's not just the private sector, it's national imperatives, it's the space race, it's the race to the moon all over again. And you're just not seeing as much of that in Japan.